She could not remember where she was, or so she said. 70-year-old Eula Santana sat, bewildered, at the defense table, wringing a lace handkerchief and calling the prosecutor young man, even though he was 50. Her grey curls shook as she insisted she barely remembered her own name. The courtroom sighed collectively. Another sad story of a confused grandmother accused of an accidental tragedy. But tragedy takes rehearsal. Behind the soft voice and blank stares lay calculation. The jury did not see the months of practice, the studied mimicry of Alzheimer's, the online orders for arsenic wrapped in cleaning labels. For a time, she fooled them all, until the prosecutor dimmed the courtroom lights and pressed play on the truth. On the screen, she was no frail widow. She was focused, sharp, fixing her sweater before rehearsing confusion in the mirror. Even the jurors she had charmed turned cold. By the end of the trial, no one doubted her memory anymore. Eula remembered everything, especially how to lie. The Willow Bend County Courthouse sat on the edge of the small Florida town, a low-slung building of cream-colored stucco and red tile roof that had been built in the 1960s and renovated multiple times since. On this humid November morning, the main courtroom was filled with spectators, most of them elderly residents of the retirement community where both Eula Santana and her deceased sister had lived. The case had gripped the community with particular intensity. One of their own, accused of murder. A woman who seemed so gentle, so confused, so harmless. Eula entered the courtroom slowly, supported by a bailiff who held her elbow as if she might fall at any moment. She wore a pale lavender dress with a lace collar, sensible shoes, and carried a small purse clutched tightly in her hands. Her grey hair was styled in soft curls, and her face bore the lines of 7 decades, but also a kind of sweetness that made people instinctively want to help her. She moved to the defense table with shuffling steps, her eyes darting around the room as if she could not quite process where she was. Her attorney, a public defender named Gerald Moss in his early 50s, with thinning hair and a patient demeanor, stood as she approached. He pulled out her chair and helped her sit down, speaking to her in a gentle voice. "Are you comfortable, Miss Santana?" Eula looked at him with confusion. "Where is the doctor? Is this the hospital?" Moss patted her hand. "No, Miss Santana. We are in court, remember? We talked about this." Eula nodded slowly, her expression still uncertain. "Oh, yes, the court." She looked around the room again, her gaze settling on the judge's empty bench. "Is that where Mr. Reverend sits?" A few people in the gallery chuckled softly. The mixture of confusion and innocence was endearing, almost charming. This poor woman clearly did not understand what was happening. Judge Merrin Cole entered through the side door, her black robes flowing as she ascended to the bench. Cole was a woman in her early 60s with sharp features and steel-grey hair cut short. She had presided over criminal cases in Willow Bend County for 16 years and had developed a keen ability to distinguish genuine confusion from performance. As she looked down at Eula Santana, she felt the first stirrings of suspicion. The clerk called the court to order and read the charges. "Eula Santana, you are charged with second-degree murder in the death of your sister, Beatrice Santana. How do you plead?" Moss stood. "Your Honor, My client wishes to enter a plea of not guilty. Additionally, we are filing a motion regarding her competency to stand trial. Miss Santana suffers from early-stage dementia and has significant difficulty understanding the proceedings. Judge Cole looked at Eula, who was staring at her hands as if discovering them for the first time. The motion will be taken under advisement. We will proceed with a competency hearing at the appropriate time. For now, the plea is entered. At the prosecution table sat Noah Brandt, the district attorney for Willowbend County. Brandt was a man in his early 50s, with dark hair going grey at the temples and the focused intensity of someone who had spent 25 years prosecuting criminals. He had reviewed this case extensively, and everything about it troubled him. The supposed dementia, the convenient memory lapses, the way Eula could not remember the judge's name, but remembered precisely when her sister's will had been changed. Brandt leaned toward his co-counsel, a younger attorney named Lisa Park, and muttered, "She remembers the things that serve her." Park nodded, every single time. The investigation had begun 4 months earlier, when Beatrice Santana, a wealthy widow of 72, had died suddenly at the Sunset Gardens retirement community. Beatrice had been in good health, actively involved in the community's social activities, and was planning a cruise to Alaska. Her death had been unexpected and, initially, unexplained. The medical examiner had ordered a toxicology screen as part of the routine autopsy. What came back had been shocking. High levels of arsenic in Beatrice's system, consistent with poisoning over a period of several weeks. The medical examiner had immediately contacted law enforcement. Detective V. Ramirez had been assigned to the case. Ramirez was a woman in her late 30s with sharp instincts and a methodical approach to investigation. She had begun by interviewing everyone close to Beatrice, and one name kept appearing. Eula, Beatrice's younger sister, who had moved into the retirement community 6 months earlier after claiming she needed help managing her finances. The two sisters had been close, or so it seemed. They took meals together, attended activities together, and Eula had taken on the role of caretaker, helping Beatrice with medications and preparing her morning tea. That tea, Ramirez would discover, had been the delivery method for the poison. Ramirez had obtained a warrant to search Eula's apartment. What she found was disturbing. A journal with handwritten recipes, including detailed measurements and notes. One page had caught her attention immediately. It was titled Beatrice's Special Tea, and listed ingredients including chamomile, honey, and a third item that had been heavily crossed out, but was still partially visible beneath the scribbles. Arsenic trioxide, 2 milligrams. When Ramirez had confronted Eula with this evidence, Eula had stared at the journal as if she had never seen it before. "That is not mine," she had said softly. "I do not remember writing that. I forget things now. My doctor says it is dementia," Ramirez had pressed. "But this is your handwriting, is it not?" Eula had shrugged helplessly. "I suppose it looks like mine, but I write so many things. I forget what I write. Sometimes I find notes I do not remember making." The performance had been convincing enough that Ramirez had requested a psychiatric evaluation. The court-appointed psychiatrist had examined Eula and reported that she showed some signs of cognitive decline, though the severity was difficult to assess. Eula had struggled with basic memory tests, could not recall the date, and seemed genuinely confused about her circumstances. But Ramirez had noticed something the psychiatrist had not. When asked about her sister's estate, about bank account numbers and property deeds, Eula's memory had been perfect. She had recited account balances with precision, remembered the exact date documents had been signed, and provided detailed information about assets. It was only when asked about incriminating details, about the tea, about the journal, about her own actions, that the confusion returned. The trial began with opening statements. Brandt approached the jury, a group of 12 citizens who had been selected after careful voir dire. Moss had tried to seat jurors who would be sympathetic to an elderly defendant, who would see Eula as a confused grandmother rather than a calculating killer. Brandt had tried to seat jurors who would focus on evidence rather than emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brandt began, his voice clear and measured. "This case is about greed disguised as love and murder disguised as care." Eula Santana poisoned her sister Beatrice slowly, methodically, over a period of weeks. She did it to inherit her sister's estate, an estate worth approximately $800,000. And when she was caught, she hid behind a claim of dementia, pretending not to remember what she had done. But the evidence will show that Eula Santana remembers everything. She simply chooses to forget what is inconvenient. Moss delivered the defense opening with gentle sympathy. He painted Eula as a tragic figure, a woman whose mind was failing her, who had loved her sister deeply and would never intentionally harm anyone. The journal entries were the confused scribblings of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. The arsenic, if it had indeed been administered, must have been an accident, a terrible mistake made by someone who could no longer reliably remember what medications were what. "Look at her," Moss said, gesturing toward Eula. "This is not the face of a murderer. This is a frightened, confused woman who barely understands why she is here." Eula sat at the defense table with her hands folded, her expression one of gentle bewilderment. When Moss mentioned Beatrice's name, Eula's eyes filled with tears, and she dabbed at them with her handkerchief. Several jurors looked at her with visible sympathy. But Judge Cole was watching more carefully. She noticed that Eula's tears appeared on cue, that they stopped as soon as the cameras turned away, and that beneath the confusion, Eula's eyes tracked everything happening in the courtroom with sharp intelligence. The prosecution's first witnesses were residents of Sunset Gardens who had known both sisters. They testified about the relationship between Eula and Beatrice, describing it as close but occasionally strained. One neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Chen, testified that she had overheard an argument between the sisters 2 months before Beatrice's death. "What were they arguing about?" Brandt asked. Dorothy shifted in her seat. "Money. Beatrice was saying something about how Eula needed to be more responsible with her own finances instead of always asking for help. And Eula said, her voice dropping, Eula said, 'When you are gone, it will all be mine anyway.'" Moss objected, arguing hearsay. Judge Cole allowed it as a statement against interest. Another witness, a man named Robert Mills, testified about Eula's routine of bringing Beatrice tea every morning. "She was very particular about it," he said. "She would always prepare it herself, would not let anyone else help. She said it was a special recipe." The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Lang, took the stand and described the autopsy findings in clinical detail. The deceased showed elevated levels of arsenic in her hair, nails, and organs. The pattern of distribution indicates chronic exposure over a period of approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Death was caused by acute arsenic poisoning, resulting in multi-organ failure. Brandt asked Dr. Lang, "Could this poisoning have been accidental?" Dr. Lang shook her head firmly. "The levels we found are consistent with deliberate administration. Accidental exposure to arsenic, such as from contaminated water or environmental sources, would show different distribution patterns and lower concentrations. This was intentional poisoning." Throughout this testimony, Eula sat with a puzzled expression, occasionally leaning toward Moss to whisper questions. "Is that doctor talking about Beatrice? What happened to Beatrice?" Her performance of confusion was consistent, and several jurors seemed moved by it. But Brandt had noticed something. When Dr. Lang had mentioned the timeline of the poisoning, Eula's expression had flickered for just a moment. Not confusion, calculation, as if she were checking the timeline against her own memory and confirming it matched. The financial evidence came next. A forensic accountant named Michael Torres took the stand and walked the jury through Beatrice's estate. Beatrice had been a wealthy woman, having inherited money from her late husband and invested it wisely over decades. Her will, updated 6 months before her death, left everything to Eula. Brandt asked, "Mr. Torres, was this a recent change to the will?" Torres nodded. "Yes. The previous version of the will, written 10 years earlier, split the estate between Eula and 2 nephews. The new will, executed 6 months ago, left everything solely to Eula." "And who suggested this change?" "According to the attorney who drafted it, Eula accompanied Beatrice to the appointment and was present during the discussion. The attorney noted that Eula was very involved in ensuring the language was correct." Moss objected, arguing the testimony was prejudicial. Judge Cole overruled. "The witness may testify to what the attorney reported." Torres continued. "Additionally, in the 3 months before Beatrice's death, there were several large transfers from Beatrice's account to an offshore account controlled by Eula. The total transferred was approximately $200,000. Brandt displayed bank records on the courtroom screen. "And these transfers were authorized how?" Torres pointed to signatures on the documents. "These bear Beatrice's signature, but our analysis suggests they were signed under circumstances of possible coercion or diminished capacity. The signatures show tremor and hesitation, not present in earlier documents." During a break, Eula performed her confusion routine for the reporters who approached her in the hallway. She smiled sweetly at them, called one of them "sweet boy," and asked if they knew where her sister was. "I have not seen Beatrice in so long. Is she still at the hospital?" The reporters ate it up, scribbling notes about the tragic grandmother who did not even understand that her sister was dead. But Brandt, watching from across the hall, saw the truth. As soon as Eula thought no one was looking, as soon as the cameras turned away, her expression changed. The sweetness vanished, replaced by sharp focus as she listened intently to her attorney discussing trial strategy. The trial moved into its 2nd week. Detective Ramirez took the stand and described the investigation in detail. She walked the jury through the search of Eula's apartment, the discovery of the journal, the interview process. She presented the journal itself, now sealed in an evidence bag, and read from it. One entry, dated 2 months before Beatrice's death, read, "She will not listen. She thinks I am irresponsible. When the estate is mine, I will show her what responsible looks like." Brandt asked, "Detective, when you interviewed Miss Santana about this journal, What did she say? Ramirez consulted her notes. She said she did not remember writing it. She claimed her memory was failing and that she often wrote things she later forgot. Did you find that claim credible? Ramirez paused, choosing her words carefully. I found it convenient. When asked about financial details or estate matters, her memory was perfect. When asked about incriminating evidence, she suddenly could not remember anything. Moss's cross-examination tried to paint Ramirez as biased against elderly defendants, as someone who could not accept that genuine cognitive decline might explain the inconsistencies. But Ramirez held firm. I have worked with many elderly witnesses and defendants, she said. I know what real dementia looks like. This was not it. The prosecution called a neurologist, Dr. Amanda Cross, who specialized in dementia and cognitive disorders. Dr. Cross had reviewed Eula's medical records and the psychiatric evaluation. Her testimony was damning. In my professional opinion, Dr. Cross said, the pattern of memory loss Miss Santana displays is inconsistent with any known form of dementia. She shows selective amnesia for events that incriminate her, while maintaining perfect recall for complex financial information. This is not a medical condition. This is malingering. Brandt asked, Can you explain what malingering means? Dr. Cross nodded. Malingering is the deliberate fabrication or exaggeration of symptoms for a specific purpose, usually to avoid responsibility or gain advantage. In this case, Miss Santana is feigning cognitive impairment to avoid accountability for her actions. Could she be successfully faking dementia symptoms? Absolutely. There are many resources available online that describe dementia symptoms. Someone intelligent and motivated could study those symptoms and reproduce them convincingly, especially to lay people who are not trained to detect malingering. Throughout this testimony, Eula maintained her confused expression, but when Dr. Cross had mentioned online resources, Eula had blinked rapidly, a micro-expression of concern that Judge Cole had caught. The competency hearing had been scheduled for the middle of the second week. Moss had formally requested that the court evaluate whether Eula was mentally fit to stand trial. If the court found her incompetent, the trial would be suspended and she would be sent to a psychiatric facility for treatment until such time as she could be restored to competency, if ever. The hearing took place in the same courtroom, but with only the judge, the attorneys, and Eula present. No jury. Judge Cole would make the determination herself. Moss called a psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Vance, who had evaluated Eula at the request of the defense. Dr. Vance was a man in his 60s with a calm, professional demeanor. He testified that Eula showed significant signs of cognitive decline, difficulty with short-term memory, confusion about time and place, and an inability to understand complex legal concepts. She becomes disoriented easily, Dr. Vance said. She has trouble maintaining focus during conversations. When I asked her to explain the charges against her, she could not provide a coherent answer. Brandt cross-examined carefully. Dr. Vance, how many sessions did you spend with Miss Santana? 3 sessions, each lasting approximately 1 hour. And during those sessions, did you test her memory for anything other than the case facts? Dr. Vance hesitated. I asked her general orientation questions, date, location, current events. And how did she perform? She struggled with most of them. Did you ask her any questions about her finances, about her sister's estate? Dr. Vance frowned. No, I did not think that was relevant to competency. Brandt approached the witness stand. Dr. Vance, Would you be surprised to learn that just 2 weeks ago, Miss Santana met with her financial advisor and discussed in detail her plans for investing the money from her sister's estate, including specific stock recommendations and tax strategies? Dr. Vance looked uncomfortable. If that is true, it would be inconsistent with the level of impairment she displayed during my evaluation. Brandt introduced a sworn affidavit from the financial advisor, confirming the meeting and describing Eula as sharp and detail-oriented. Dr. Vance read it in silence, his expression troubled. The prosecution then called their own expert, a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Helen Monroe, who specialized in detecting malingering. Dr. Monroe had not examined Eula directly, but had reviewed all the medical records, the psychiatric evaluations, and extensive video footage of Eula's behavior, both in and out of court. Dr. Monroe, Brandt asked, what is your opinion regarding Miss Santana's claimed cognitive impairment? Dr. Monroe spoke with clinical precision. In my professional opinion, Miss Santana is malingering. She is feigning dementia symptoms to avoid criminal responsibility. The pattern of her deficits is inconsistent with genuine neurological disease. She shows knowledge and memory when it serves her interests, and confusion when it protects her. Can you explain what led you to this conclusion? Dr. Monroe pulled out a chart. I analyzed 47 instances where Miss Santana was observed in various settings. In 29 of those instances, when she believed she was being evaluated for competency, or when cameras were present, she displayed pronounced symptoms of confusion, memory loss, and disorientation. In 18 instances, when she believed she was not being observed or was engaged in matters related to her own interests, she displayed normal cognitive function, complex reasoning, and excellent memory. She displayed video clips on the courtroom screen. One showed Eula in court, appearing confused and calling her attorney doctor. The next showed Eula in the jail visiting room, speaking clearly and strategically with Moss about trial tactics, her voice sharp and her reasoning sophisticated. Judge Cole watched these clips with growing anger. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Based on this analysis, Dr. Monroe continued, I conclude that Miss Santana is competent to stand trial. She understands the charges against her. She understands the legal process, and she is capable of assisting in her own defense. She is simply choosing to pretend otherwise. Judge Cole ruled swiftly. Based on the evidence presented, I find the defendant competent to stand trial. The proceedings will continue. Eula's expression had remained blank throughout the hearing, but when the ruling was announced, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Anger, perhaps, or calculation. She had lost this round, but the performance would continue. The trial resumed with the prosecution calling witnesses who had interacted with Eula in the weeks following her arrest. A jail nurse testified that Eula had perfect recall of her medication schedule and had even corrected the nurse once when she had brought the wrong dosage. She knew exactly what she was taking and why, the nurse said. There was no confusion there. A jail guard testified about a conversation he had overheard between Eula and another inmate. Eula had been discussing her case, explaining the legal strategy, and had said, "They cannot prove I did it on purpose if I cannot remember doing it." The guard had found the comment troubling enough to report it. Moss objected vigorously, arguing that jailhouse conversations should not be admissible. Judge Cole allowed it as a statement against interest. The prosecution also presented evidence of Eula's internet search history, recovered from her computer during the search of her apartment. In the 3 months before Beatrice's death, Eula had searched for symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, how to fake dementia, best ways to administer poison without detection, and arsenic dosage calculator. Each search was time-stamped and saved in the browser history. Eula had attempted to delete the history, but the forensic team had recovered it from the hard drive. The searches painted a clear picture of someone researching how to commit murder and how to avoid responsibility afterward. Brandt displayed the searches on the courtroom screen, reading each one aloud. The jury stared at Eula with increasing horror. This was not a confused grandmother. This was a calculating killer who had planned every detail. During another recess, Eula maintained her performance for the cameras. She smiled sweetly, asked a reporter if he knew where the bathroom was, even though she had been using the same bathroom for 2 weeks, and commented that the courtroom was very bright and she did not like bright lights. But a reporter from the local television station had positioned himself at an angle where he could see Eula when she thought she was not being filmed. He captured footage of her dropping the act the moment she stepped into the hallway, her posture straightening, her expression sharpening, her eyes scanning the corridor with perfect awareness. The footage aired that evening on the local news. The contrast between the confused act and the lucid reality was stark. Public opinion, which had been somewhat sympathetic to Eula, began to shift. Detective Ramirez had continued investigating even as the trial progressed. She had learned that Eula had visited a neurologist 3 weeks before Beatrice's death, complaining of memory problems and asking to be tested for dementia. The doctor, a specialist named Dr. Andrew Harris, had conducted a thorough evaluation. Ramirez obtained the medical records and discovered something interesting. Dr. Harris had noted in his report that Eula's symptoms were inconsistent and that she seemed to be exaggerating her deficits. He had written, "Patient appears to be performing symptoms rather than experiencing them. Recommend psychological evaluation for possible factitious disorder." But what caught Ramirez's attention was a note in the file about the office's security system. Dr. Harris operated out of a large medical facility that had comprehensive security cameras in all common areas and waiting rooms. Ramirez wondered if those cameras had captured anything relevant. She requested the footage from the medical facility, submitting a warrant for all video from the day of Eula's appointment. The facility security office provided several hours of footage. Ramirez spent 2 days reviewing it, and what she found was devastating. The footage showed Eula arriving at the medical facility, checking in at the reception desk, and being directed to a waiting area. While waiting, Eula sat alone, and the camera captured her pulling out a small notebook and reviewing it, her lips moving as she silently rehearsed something. When a nurse called her name, Eula stood, took a deep breath, and then allowed her shoulders to slump and her expression to go vacant before walking into the examination room. But it was the footage after the appointment that was most damning. Eula exited the examination room and returned to the waiting area. She was told to wait while the office processed her checkout paperwork. She sat down in a chair positioned near a mirror on the wall. The security camera, positioned at an angle, captured both Eula and her reflection. Alone in the waiting area, Eula practiced. She looked into the mirror and rehearsed expressions of confusion, tilting her head, letting her mouth hang slightly open, allowing her eyes to go unfocused. She recited phrases. "Where am I? Who are you? I forget things." She adjusted her posture, making herself appear more stooped and frail. Then she smiled at her reflection, a sharp, satisfied smile, and whispered something inaudible. The camera's audio was not perfect, but the forensic team enhanced it. What Eula had whispered was, "I've still got it." Ramirez brought the footage to Brandt immediately. "This is it," she said. "This proves she was faking the whole time." Brandt watched the footage 3 times, his expression hardening with each viewing. "This is exactly what we needed. She is performing dementia like an actress preparing for a role." He filed a motion to introduce the footage as evidence, designating it as newly discovered material that went directly to the defendant's credibility and her claim of cognitive impairment. Moss objected strenuously, arguing that the footage was prejudicial and invaded Eula's privacy. Judge Cole reviewed the footage in chambers with both attorneys present. She watched it twice, her expression growing colder with each viewing. When it ended, she looked at Moss. "Your client is rehearsing symptoms of a disease she does not have in order to avoid responsibility for murder. This footage is absolutely admissible." Motion granted. Moss tried one more argument. "Your Honor, even if this footage shows Miss Santana practicing, it does not prove she does not actually have cognitive impairment. People with dementia can have lucid moments." Judge Cole's voice was ice. "Mr. Moss, that footage shows your client whispering to herself that she still has it. That is not a lucid moment. That is a confession of deception. The footage will be shown to the jury." The trial entered its 3rd week. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. The initial sympathy for Eula had eroded. Jurors who had previously looked at her with pity now looked at her with suspicion. And Eula, sensing the change, had modified her performance slightly. The confusion was still there, but it was tempered now with moments of what appeared to be clarity, as if she were trying to seem more credible by acknowledging occasional competence. But it was too late. The prosecution was preparing to play the security footage, and everyone in the courtroom knew it would be the defining moment of the trial. Brandt called Detective Ramirez back to the stand. She testified about discovering the footage, obtaining the warrant, and working with the forensic team to authenticate it. She confirmed the date and timestamps, verified the chain of custody, and explained the technical process of enhancing the audio. Then Brandt called the security director from the medical facility, a former police officer named Thomas Reed. Reed testified about the security system, the camera placement, the automatic recording and storage protocols. He confirmed that the footage had not been edited or altered in any way, that it was a direct copy of the original file stored on the facility's secure servers. Moss cross-examined aggressively, trying to create doubt about the authenticity of the footage, the quality of the audio enhancement, the possibility that someone had tampered with the files. But Reed was unshakable. The footage was genuine and unaltered. Finally, Brandt stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, at this time, the state would like to present the security footage for the jury." Judge Cole nodded. "The court will view the evidence." The courtroom lights were dimmed. A large screen was positioned where the jury could see it clearly. Brandt loaded the file and pressed play. The footage began with Eula entering the medical facility's waiting area after her appointment. She sat down, looking around to ensure she was alone. Then she pulled out the notebook and began reviewing it, her expression focused and intent. The camera captured her silently mouthing words, practicing her lines. The jury watched in absolute silence. Several jurors leaned forward, their expressions hardening. Then came the moment in front of the mirror. Eula rehearsing her confusion, practicing her vacant stare, adjusting her posture to appear more frail. The transformation was visible and deliberate. She was an actress preparing for a performance, and the role she was preparing for was dementia. And then the whisper. enhanced by the forensic team so the jury could hear it clearly. "I've still got it." Followed by that smile, sharp, cold, satisfied. The smile of someone who believed she had successfully deceived everyone. The footage ended. The lights came back up. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Eula sat at the defense table, her carefully maintained expression of confusion finally completely shattered. She stared at the blank screen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her breathing shallow. For the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely afraid. The jury was staring at her now, and there was no sympathy left in their eyes, only disgust and anger. Brandt remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, "you have just witnessed the defendant preparing to deceive everyone, preparing to fake a disease, preparing to hide behind a condition she does not have. That footage was taken 3 weeks before she murdered her sister. She was already planning her defense, already rehearsing her lies." Moss tried to salvage the situation during his closing argument, but there was nothing he could say. The footage had destroyed Eula's credibility completely. He argued weakly that even if Eula had exaggerated her symptoms, it did not prove she had committed murder. But the jury was not listening anymore. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict with a voice that shook slightly, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what they had decided. "On the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, we find the defendant guilty." Eula's hands flew to her mouth. For a moment, the mask dropped completely, and what showed beneath was not confusion, but raw, cold fury. Then she caught herself, and the confused expression tried to return, but it was too late. Everyone had seen the truth. Judge Cole set sentencing for 2 weeks later. The 2 weeks between the verdict and sentencing passed slowly for everyone involved in the case. Eula remained in custody at the county jail, her bail revoked after the conviction. According to the jail staff, she had abandoned much of her confused act once she was back in her cell. She no longer called guards by wrong names or pretended not to know where she was. She sat in her cell and read books from the jail library, her reading comprehension apparently perfect. The case had attracted significant media attention. The security footage had been shown on local and national news programs, often with commentary from legal experts and psychologists discussing the phenomenon of malingering in criminal cases. Eula had become, almost overnight, a symbol of calculated deception. The frail grandmother act that had initially garnered sympathy now generated outrage. Beatrice's family, which included 2 nephews who had been cut out of the will and several cousins who had been close to Beatrice, prepared their victim impact statements. They wanted the court to understand not just what Eula had done, but who Beatrice had been. The woman she had killed was not just a name in a police report. She was a person with a life, with relationships, with dreams that had been stolen. The sentencing hearing took place on a grey December morning. The courtroom was once again filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when Eula Santana would finally face the full weight of her crime. Eula entered the courtroom wearing her orange jumpsuit, the white undershirt visible at the collar. She no longer had the lace handkerchief, or the carefully styled hair. Her grey curls were pulled back in a simple clip, and her face, without the performance, looked harder than it had during the trial. She walked to the defense table without assistance, her gait steady and sure. No more shuffling steps, no more pretense of frailty. Judge Cole entered and called the court to order. She looked down at Eula with an expression of cold assessment. "Before I impose sentence, I will hear victim impact statements." She gestured to the prosecution table. "Mr. Brandt, you may proceed." The first to speak was Thomas Garrett, one of Beatrice's nephews. He was a man in his late 40s, with greying hair and the weary look of someone who had spent months processing grief and betrayal. He approached the podium slowly, carrying a photograph of Beatrice. He set the photograph on the podium where everyone could see it. Beatrice was smiling in the picture, sitting on a beach somewhere warm, her face lit with genuine happiness. Thomas spoke in a voice that was steady but weighted with emotion. "My Aunt Beatrice was one of the kindest people I ever knew. After my father died when I was 12, she stepped in to help my mother. She paid for my college education. She came to my wedding. She was there when my children were born. She was family in the truest sense of the word." He paused, looking at Eula. "And you killed her for money. Money you did not need. Money you had no right to. You poisoned her slowly, over weeks, making her suffer. And when she was gone, you pretended to be too confused to remember what you had done." Thomas's voice grew harder. "We watched you in this courtroom, playing your little game, calling the prosecutor young man, pretending you did not know where you were, and we knew you were lying. But we had to sit there and watch you mock our pain, mock her memory, mock the entire process of justice." He picked up the photograph. Beatrice deserved to live out her years in peace. She deserved to take that Alaska cruise she had been planning. She deserved to see her great-grandchildren grow up. You took all of that from her. And from us. Thomas returned to his seat, his hands trembling slightly. His brother, Michael Garrett, spoke next. He described Beatrice's generosity, her sense of humor, her love of gardening and reading. He described visiting her at Sunset Gardens and seeing how happy she was to have Eula living there with her. How Beatrice had told him that she was glad she could help her younger sister. "She trusted you," Michael said, his voice breaking. "She loved you. And you used that love to poison her." A cousin named Patricia spoke about the financial devastation Eula had caused the family. Beyond the emotional loss, she had stolen money that Beatrice had intended to leave to her nephews and their children. Money that had been earmarked for college funds, for helping family members who were struggling. Eula had taken it all and hidden it in offshore accounts. "You did not just kill one person," Patricia said. "You hurt all of us. You stole our futures along with hers." One by one, family members spoke. Each one added another layer to the portrait of what had been lost. By the time they finished, several jurors who had remained for the sentencing were crying quietly. Then came the moment that would define the hearing. Judge Cole addressed Eula directly. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench, her gaze fixed on the defendant with absolute clarity. Miss Santana, stand. Eula stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, she tried to adopt the confused expression again, her shoulders rounding, her head tilting. But Judge Cole's voice cut through the performance like a blade. Drop the act. I have seen the footage. This entire court has seen the footage. We know who you are. Eula's posture straightened. The confusion vanished from her face, replaced by something cold and defiant.
Judge Cole continued, her voice hard and unyielding. Throughout this trial, you have performed. You have mocked this court, mocked the jury, mocked the memory of your sister, and mocked the concept of justice itself. You sat at that table and pretended to be a confused, helpless old woman. You called me Mr. Reverend. You asked where the hospital was. You wrung your handkerchief and wiped away fake tears. The judge leaned forward. But we saw through it. The jury saw through it. And that security footage revealed exactly what you are. Not a victim of disease, not a confused grandmother, but a calculating, cold-blooded killer who planned every detail of your sister's murder and then planned exactly how you would avoid responsibility for it. Eula said nothing. Her jaw was clenched, her hands tight on the table.
You poisoned your sister, Judge Cole said, her voice rising. You fed her arsenic in her morning tea, day after day, week after week. You watched her get sicker, you watched her suffer, and you kept poisoning her until she died. And you did it for money, for an estate you wanted to control, for accounts you wanted to empty. The judge picked up the sentencing document. And when you were caught, you did not show remorse, you did not confess, you did not accept responsibility. Instead, you went online and researched how to fake dementia. You studied the symptoms of Alzheimer's like an actress studying a script. You practiced in front of mirrors. You rehearsed your lines. Judge Cole's voice dropped to a deadly calm. You exploited trust the way others exploit weakness. You mocked illness and murdered family. You weaponized sympathy and turned the courtroom into your stage. She paused, letting the words settle over the silent courtroom. Age is wisdom's gift, not its excuse. You are 70 years old. You have lived a long life. You have accumulated experience and, presumably, some measure of understanding about right and wrong. And you used all of that experience, all of that understanding, to plan and execute a murder, and then to deceive everyone around you. Eula's defiant expression was beginning to crack. Her breathing had become shallow, her hands trembling slightly. Your performance, Judge Cole said, was remarkable in its consistency. For weeks you maintained the act, but the security footage captured the truth. It captured you rehearsing. It captured you smiling at your own reflection after a successful practice session. It captured you whispering, "I've still got it." The judge leaned back in her chair. The law allows me to consider your age in sentencing, and I have considered it. But your age does not mitigate what you did. If anything, it makes it worse. You had 70 years to develop empathy, conscience, basic human decency, and you used those 70 years to become a more effective predator. Judge Cole read from the sentencing document. Under Florida law, second-degree murder carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will be transferred to a state correctional facility where you will remain
for the rest of your natural life. Eula's legs buckled slightly. She caught herself on the edge of the table. Her mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. The defiance drained from her face, replaced by something that might have been genuine shock. Judge Cole was not finished. You will have decades to reflect on what you did, Miss Santana. Decades to sit in a cell and think about your sister's suffering, about the family you destroyed, about the life you threw away for money you will never spend. The judge's voice hardened one final time. The mercy you counterfeited now eludes you for life. You practiced confusion, but you will experience genuine isolation. You performed frailty, but you will experience genuine confinement. And you whispered that you still had it. But what you have now, Miss Santana, is nothing. Nothing but years and regret, and the knowledge that your performance fooled no one. Judge Cole brought down the gavel. This court is adjourned. Eula stood motionless for a long moment. Then, quietly, so quietly that only those closest to her heard it, she whispered, "I almost made it." The bailiffs moved to escort her out. As they approached, Eula suddenly turned toward the gallery where her family members sat. Her expression twisted into something ugly and desperate. "You," she said, pointing at Thomas. "You always wanted her money. You were just waiting for her to die so you could have it." Thomas stared at her, his expression one of profound sadness rather than anger. "No, Aunt Eula. We wanted her alive. That is the difference between us." Eula's face crumpled. The bailiffs took her arms and began leading her toward the side door. She walked between them, her shoulders hunched, her head down. The performance was finally, completely over. As she reached the door, one reporter called out, "Miss Santana, do you have anything to say to your sister's family?" Eula stopped. She turned her head slightly, looking back at the courtroom one last time. Her expression was no longer confused or defiant or afraid. It was simply empty. "At least they will never forget me," she said. Then she walked through the door and was gone. The courtroom sat in heavy silence for a long moment. Then, gradually, people began to gather their belongings, to stand, to leave. The family members embraced each other, their relief mixed with exhaustion. The jury members who had stayed for sentencing filed out quietly, several of them looking shaken by what they had witnessed. Noah Brandt sat at the prosecution table, organizing his files. Lisa Park, his co-counsel, sat beside him. "That was one of the hardest I have ever done," she said quietly. Brandt nodded. "She almost got away with it. If Detective Ramirez had not found that footage, if we had not been able to prove the malingering, a jury might have bought the dementia defense. Do you think she has any remorse at all?" Brandt considered the question. "No. I think she is angry she got caught. I think she believes she deserved to get away with it because she planned it so well. But remorse? I did not see any." Detective Ramirez joined them at the table. She had sat through the entire sentencing hearing, watching Eula's performance collapse under the weight of the judge's words. "Justice," she said simply. Brandt looked at her. You broke this case. That footage was the key. Ramirez shook her head. The evidence was always there. The journal, the searches, the financial records. The footage just made it undeniable. It took away her last hiding place. The three of them left the courtroom together, walking out into the December sunlight. Outside, reporters were conducting interviews with family members, legal experts were providing analysis for the cameras, and the machinery of media coverage was already processing the case into headlines and sound bites. But for those who had worked the case, who had spent months uncovering the truth, the story was simpler. A woman had killed her sister for money. She had tried to hide behind a performance of mental illness, and she had failed. Eula was transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution, a women's prison in Central Florida. She was processed, assigned a cell, given standard prison clothing, and told the rules of the facility. The staff had been briefed about her case, about her history of manipulation, about her tendency to perform symptoms to gain advantage. In her cell that first night, Eula sat on the narrow bed and stared at the concrete wall. The performance that had sustained her for months was gone. There were no cameras here, no jury to charm, no sympathy to exploit, just walls and time. She thought about Beatrice, not with remorse, but with a kind of bitter calculation. She had been so close. The will had been changed. The money had been transferred. Beatrice's death had been attributed to the poisoning, but without proof of who had administered it, Eula had believed she could claim confusion, claim accident, claim anything but intent. And she had almost succeeded. The Dementia Act had been good. She had studied it carefully, practiced it thoroughly. She had fooled doctors, fooled lawyers, even fooled some of the jury initially. But the security camera had captured what she thought was private. Her rehearsal, her smile, her whispered confidence. And that had destroyed everything. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. 70 years old, and this was how her story ended. Not with the comfort of Beatrice's estate, not with the financial security she had killed to obtain, but with a cell and a sentence that would last until she died. The broader impact of the case rippled outward in the months that followed. Legal scholars wrote articles about malingering in criminal trials, about the challenges of detecting fake mental illness, about the importance of comprehensive investigation. The security footage became a teaching tool in law schools and forensic psychology programs, an example of how surveillance technology could reveal truth that might otherwise remain hidden. Florida legislators introduced a bill that would require courts to appoint independent forensic psychiatrists in all cases where a defendant claimed mental incompetence, rather than relying solely on defense experts. The bill was nicknamed Eula's Law, and it passed with strong bipartisan support. The Sunset Gardens retirement community instituted new protocols for monitoring residents' medications and food preparation, ensuring that no single person had unsupervised access to another resident's meals. The administration acknowledged that they should have noticed the pattern earlier, should have questioned why Eula was so insistent on preparing Beatrice's tea herself. Beatrice's estate, after being tied up in legal proceedings for months, was finally distributed according to her original will, the one that predated Eula's manipulation. The nephews received their intended shares,
The cousins received their bequests, and a significant portion was donated to charity in Beatrice's name, supporting causes she had cared about during her life. Thomas Garrett used his portion of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in forensic science. He named it the Beatrice Santana Memorial Scholarship, ensuring that his aunt would be remembered not for how she died, but for the generosity that had defined her life.
The case also sparked conversations in retirement communities across Florida and beyond. Residents became more aware of the signs of elder financial abuse, more vigilant about protecting vulnerable members of their communities. Support groups were established for families dealing with similar situations, providing resources and advocacy. Judge Merrin Cole retired 2 years after the Santana trial, citing it as one of the cases that had most affected her during her time on the bench. In an interview after her retirement, she was asked what she remembered most about Eula Santana. "The smile," Judge Cole said. When that security footage showed her smiling at her reflection after practicing her confused act, that smile told me everything I needed to know about who she was. It was not the smile of someone who was sick. It was the smile of someone who believed she was smarter than everyone else. And the tragedy is that she was smart. She was intelligent, educated, capable. She could have done anything with her life. But she chose to use that intelligence to kill her sister and try to escape justice. That is what I remember. The waste of it all.